James Carter had always wanted to travel the world. Ever since he was a child, he had been fascinated by different countries, their cultures, and their history. Growing up in a small town, he had spent hours watching travel documentaries and reading about famous places. Now, at 28 years old, he had finally saved enough money to take a trip to Europe, a dream he had been planning for years. Excitement filled James as he stepped off the plane and looked around at the grand airport. The air smelled different, the people spoke in an accent he wasn't used to, and everything felt new and exciting. He couldn't believe he was finally here. His itinerary was packed with famous landmarks, delicious food spots, and must-visit attractions. But there was one place he was especially eager to see: the Royal Palace. The Royal Palace was one of the most famous landmarks in the country. Thousands of tourists visited every day, hoping to catch a glimpse of its beauty, history, and the well-known royal guards, soldiers who stood still for hours, no matter what happened around them. James had seen videos of people trying to make the guards laugh or react, but they never moved. It amazed him how disciplined and serious they were. On the morning of his visit, James woke up early, grabbed his camera, and set off to explore. The city streets were full of life, people rushing to work, children running with backpacks, and the sound of street musicians playing soft melodies. He felt a deep sense of adventure. Every building seemed to hold a story. Every street corner had something interesting to see. But nothing excited him more than the thought of seeing the royal palace up close. As he arrived at the grand entrance, his eyes widened. The palace was even more stunning than he had imagined. Its golden gates stood tall, guarded by soldiers in crisp uniforms. Tourists gathered around, taking photos, whispering in amazement, and watching the guards who stood as still as statues. Some people waved their hands in front of the guards' faces, while others made silly jokes, trying to get a reaction. But no matter what they did, the guards remained serious and unmoving. James chuckled as he watched. He found it both impressive and amusing. He pulled out his phone and started recording, zooming in on the guards' faces. Their ability to remain still fascinated him. Then, a group of young tourists near him started laughing and daring each other to get closer to the guards. One of them jumped in front of a guard, made funny faces, and even pretended to tickle them. The guard didn't flinch. James felt a sudden rush of curiosity. What would happen if someone actually touched a guard? He knew they weren't supposed to react, but surely there had to be a limit. His heart pounded with excitement. What if he tried something bold? What if he became the tourist who finally got a guard to react? Without thinking much, he took a step closer, unaware that his life was about to change forever. James stood near the royal guards, his heart pounding with excitement. The idea of testing their limits had taken over his thoughts. He watched as other tourists tried to get a reaction, but the guards remained completely still. Their serious expressions, their straight posture, and their strict discipline made them seem almost unreal. A few tourists in the crowd were laughing and whispering, daring each other to do something bold. One man waved his hand right in front of a guard's face, but the soldier didn't blink. Another person pretended to drop something near a guard's feet, hoping he would look down, but nothing happened. The guards remained in their positions, completely ignoring everything around them. James smirked. He had seen plenty of videos online of people trying to mess with guards. Some made silly jokes, others danced in front of them. But no one ever got a reaction. It was as if these guards were trained to feel nothing. But James had a thought. What if someone actually touched them? Surely they had to react then. The group of young tourists next to him was getting bolder. They'd whispered and giggled, encouraging each other to try something new. One of them, a man wearing a red jacket, suddenly clapped his hands loudly right next to a guard's ear. The crowd gasped, expecting some kind of reaction. But the guard didn't move an inch. His face remained blank, his eyes locked straight ahead. James felt a strange sense of challenge. What if I go one step further? He wasn't a troublemaker, but the idea of doing something daring in a foreign country excited him. It wasn't every day that he got a chance like this. He glanced at the people around him. Some were watching the scene with curiosity, while others were busy taking pictures. Before he could stop himself, James took a step forward. His heart raced as he lifted his hand, and in a moment of impulsive excitement, lightly tapped the guard on the cheek. It wasn't a hard slap, just a playful tap. He expected the guard to remain still, just like in all the videos he had seen. Maybe the tourists around him would laugh, and he'd walk away with an interesting story to tell his friends back home. But the moment his fingers touched the guard's face, everything changed. Within seconds, there was a loud, sharp command from somewhere nearby. The guard, who had seemed frozen just a moment ago, suddenly took a step back. His face remained expressionless, but his presence felt even stronger now. James barely had time to react before he heard the sound of fast footsteps approaching. Two uniformed officers appeared almost instantly. Their movements were quick and precise, like they had been trained for this exact situation. Without a word, one officer grabbed James' arm firmly, while the other spoke into a radio. The crowd went silent. The laughter, the jokes, everything disappeared in an instant. James' heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't funny anymore. He tried to speak, to explain that it was just a harmless joke, but the officers weren't listening. The look in their eyes told him that he was in serious trouble. And for the first time since arriving in the country, James felt real fear. James felt his stomach drop as the two uniformed officers grabbed his arms. The playful excitement he had felt just moments ago disappeared completely. The crowd around him stood in shocked silence. Some people whispered to each other, while others took out their phones, recording the scene. "I didn't mean anything by it," James blurted out, trying to pull back slightly. It was just a joke. But the officers didn't listen. They remained silent, their grip firm as they started leading him away from the palace gates. James could feel every eye in the crowd on him. The cheerful energy of the tourists was now replaced with tension. Some looked concerned, while others simply watched, curious about what would happen next. As James was pulled through the large palace gates, his heart pounded. He had never been in trouble with the law before, not even in his own country. He had never been arrested, never spoken to a police officer for anything serious. But now, here he was, in a foreign country, being taken into custody for what he thought was just a harmless prank. The officers remained professional. They didn't shout. They didn't push him. But their silence was even more frightening. It made James feel like he had done something truly serious. As they entered a small security building near the palace grounds, he was led into a plain white room with a single table and two chairs. One of the officers gestured for him to sit down. James swallowed hard. "Listen," he said, forcing a nervous smile. "I really didn't mean any harm. I thought the guards weren't allowed to react, so I just..." The officer held up a hand, cutting him off. Then, without saying a word, he stepped out of the room, leaving James alone. James sat there, tapping his fingers on the table, his mind racing. What's the worst that could happen? A fine? A warning? Maybe they'll just tell me not to do it again and let me go. Minutes passed. Then the door opened again, and two different men in uniform entered. One of them carried a folder. He sat down across from James, opened the folder, and pulled out a piece of paper. He glanced at James, then spoke in a calm but serious voice. "You have committed an offense against a state-protected officer." James blinked. "What? No, it was just a joke. I barely touched him." The officer remained unfazed. The royal guards are members of the national military. Assaulting them is treated as an offense against the state. James felt cold. The word assault made it sound so much worse than what he had actually done. He hadn't punched anyone. He hadn't hurt anyone. But he could see in the officer's expression that this wasn't a small issue. The other officer leaned forward and placed another document on the table. "You will be taken to court immediately." James' breath caught in his throat. Immediately. No lawyers. No time to explain. His heart pounded harder as the realization sank in. This was not a small matter. This was serious, and he had no idea what was about to happen next. James sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Court. Immediately. This had to be a misunderstanding. Things like this didn't happen so fast, at least, not in his country. Wait, hold on, he said quickly, trying to stay calm. Can I call someone? Maybe the U.S. Embassy. This is just a mistake. I didn't mean any harm. One of the officers shook his head. You will have a chance to explain yourself in court. James felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He had been in this country for less than a week, and now he was about to stand in front of a judge. His dream vacation had turned into a nightmare in just a matter of minutes. Before he could say anything else, the officers gestured for him to stand. Slowly, he got up, his legs feeling weak. They guided him down a long hallway, through another set of doors, and into a waiting car. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the quiet, heavy feeling of something serious happening. As the car moved through the city, James stared out the window, watching the streets pass by. Just earlier that morning, he had been walking those same streets, full of excitement for his trip. Now he was being taken to court, accused of a crime he never thought was possible. Within minutes, the car pulled up to a large, official-looking building. The officers escorted him inside, where everything moved shockingly fast. James barely had time to process what was happening before he was taken to a courtroom. Inside, a judge sat at a high wooden desk, flipping through papers. There were only a few people in the room, some officers, a translator, and a few legal officials. There was no jury, no long process like in the movies. James barely had time to catch his breath before the proceedings began. A translator stood beside him, repeating the judge's words in English. You are charged with assaulting a state-protected officer, the judge read aloud. Do you have anything to say in your defense? James took a deep breath. Your Honor, I didn't mean any harm. I thought the guards weren't allowed to react. I just tapped him. It wasn't an attack. It was a misunderstanding. The judge listened but didn't show much emotion. Instead, he turned to another officer, who played security footage from the palace. James watched as a screen displayed the exact moment he had touched the guard's face. From his perspective, it had been a light tap. But on the screen, with the way the guard's head moved slightly and how quickly the officers had reacted, it looked much worse than James had thought. The judge nodded. The evidence is clear. Assaulting a royal guard is considered a serious offense. The punishment for such an act is not taken lightly in this country. James' heart pounded. What does that mean? A fine? Jail time? The judge glanced at the papers in front of him. The court will now determine your sentence. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Sentence. This was much worse than he had ever imagined. James felt his heart pounding as he stood in the courtroom, waiting for the judge's next words. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers being shuffled. His palms were sweaty, and his mind raced with questions. How bad could this really be? Would they just fine me and let me go? Maybe a warning. The judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His expression was serious, unreadable. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he spoke the words that made James' whole body go cold. You are sentenced to 5 years in prison. James' breath caught in his throat. Did I hear that right? His eyes widened, and for a moment, he couldn't move. 5 years. This had to be a mistake. There was no way they could be serious. No, James whispered, shaking his head. No, this isn't right. I didn't do anything serious. It was just a joke. His voice grew louder, panic taking over. He looked around the room, hoping someone would step in, hoping this was all some kind of misunderstanding. The translator repeated the judge's words in English once again, confirming that James had heard correctly. 5 years in prison. James felt like the world was spinning. He turned to the translator, his voice desperate. Please, Tell them I didn't mean any harm. I barely touched him. How can they do this? The translator spoke to the officials, but their expressions didn't change. The judge simply said, "The law is clear. Assaulting a royal guard is a direct offense against the state. It is treated with the highest level of seriousness." James felt his knees go weak. He wanted to argue, to beg, to do something. But it was clear that nothing he said would change their minds. The security footage had sealed his fate. In his home country, this might have been a joke, something that would get him a small fine at worst. But here, in this strict nation, it was an unforgivable act. A guard stepped forward and gestured for James to follow. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just hours ago, he had been a tourist, excited to explore a beautiful new place. Now he was being taken away like a criminal, facing years in a foreign prison. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, his body felt numb. He could hear the murmurs of people watching. Some had neutral expressions, while others looked at him with pity, but no one stepped in to help. His mind screamed for a way out, but there was none. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind him, James realized the awful truth. This was real. This was happening. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. James walked in a daze as the guards led him through a long hallway. His legs felt heavy, his mind clouded with shock. 5 years. The words echoed in his head over and over again. It didn't feel real. Just this morning, he had been a free man, enjoying his vacation, and now he was a prisoner in a foreign country. As he was taken outside, he saw a police van waiting for him. The streets that had once felt exciting and full of adventure now felt cold and distant. Tourists walked by, unaware of what had just happened inside the courtroom. Life continued as normal for everyone else, but for James, everything had changed. The guards helped him into the van and locked the doors. He stared out of the small window, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to demand a second chance, to wake up from this nightmare. How could a simple mistake cost him 5 years of his life? The van moved through the city, passing landmarks he had planned to visit. The restaurants he wanted to try, the parks he wanted to explore, none of it mattered anymore. His dream vacation had turned into a terrible reality. After a long drive, the van stopped in front of a tall building surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. The prison. James swallowed hard as the doors opened. A guard gestured for him to step out. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move. As he walked through the gates, his heart pounded. What would prison be like? Would it be dangerous? Would anyone help him? Inside, the process moved quickly. His passport, phone, and all his belongings were taken away. He was given a prison uniform and led to a small room where he was told the rules. The prison officials spoke in a firm, clear voice, while a translator repeated their words in English. You will follow all rules without question. You are not allowed to contact anyone outside without permission. Any act of disobedience will result in further punishment. James barely heard the rest. He couldn't believe this was happening. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Could he call the U.S. Embassy? Would they help him? Or was he truly stuck here for 5 long years? Finally, he was taken to his cell, a small, cold room with a hard bed and a tiny window. The door shut behind him with a loud clang, making him jump. He stood there, staring at the walls, feeling completely trapped. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to cry. He had to stay strong. He had to find a way out. As he sat on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought filled his mind. This couldn't be the end of his story. James sat on the hard prison bed, staring at the gray walls around him. The small window near the ceiling let in a little light, but it wasn't enough to make the place feel any less cold. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. 5 years. It still didn't feel real. He had never imagined his trip would end like this. Just a few days ago, he was enjoying the city, trying new foods, and taking pictures of famous landmarks. Now he was locked away in a foreign prison, facing years of his life behind bars for a mistake he never thought would be so serious. Days passed slowly. The prison routine was strict. Wake up early, eat simple meals, follow orders, and stay in the cell for most of the day. James kept to himself, not wanting to get into any trouble. He didn't know the language well, and most of the prisoners barely looked at him. He felt completely alone. The worst part was the uncertainty. Would anyone help him? Would the U.S. Embassy do something? Or was he really going to be stuck here for 5 years? He thought about his family back home. Did they even know what had happened to him yet? His stomach twisted at the thought of his mother worrying, his friends wondering where he was. One day, as he sat in the small prison yard, a guard approached him. The man spoke in his language, but James couldn't understand. Then, another officer stepped forward and translated. "You have a visitor." James' heart leaped. A visitor? Who could it be? Was it someone from the embassy? His lawyer? His hopes soared as he was led through the prison hallways to a small room with a glass barrier. A chair sat on each side, and a phone was placed on the wall for communication. James sat down, his hands shaking. A moment later, the door on the other side opened. His breath caught in his throat as a well-dressed man entered. He looked serious, holding a folder in his hands. James quickly picked up the phone, and the man did the same. "Mr. James Carter?" the man asked. "Yes," James said immediately. "Please, can you help me? I don't belong here." This was a mistake. The man nodded slightly. "I am from the U.S. Embassy. We have been informed about your case." Relief flooded James' body. Finally, someone who could help. But then, the man's face remained serious. "However," he continued, "this is a complicated situation. The government here has strict laws, and your actions were seen as a serious offense. We are doing what we can, but there are no guarantees." James' relief quickly turned to worry. "No guarantees," he repeated. "What does that mean?" "You can't just leave me here." The embassy official sighed. "We're working on it, but you must be patient." James felt his stomach sink. Patient? How long would that take? As the man stood to leave, James gripped the phone tightly. He wasn't giving up. He couldn't. There had to be a way out. James sat frozen in his chair as the embassy official left the room. His heart pounded. No guarantees. Those words echoed in his mind. He had imagined that as soon as the U.S. Embassy got involved, everything would be sorted out quickly. But now, it was clear, this wasn't going to be easy. As the guards escorted him back to his cell, he felt a mix of emotions. There was hope, but also fear. What if the embassy couldn't help him? What if he really had to spend years in prison for something he never thought was serious? The days dragged on. Every morning, James woke up hoping for news, but there was nothing. He spent his time alone, thinking about everything he had taken for granted, his freedom, his family, even the little things like walking down the street without worry. Then one afternoon, a guard came to his cell and gestured for him to follow. James' heart raced as he was led back to the visitor's room. Was it the embassy again? Had something changed? When he sat down and picked up the phone, the same embassy official was there. This time, his expression was more serious than before. "We have spoken with the authorities," the man said. "They are willing to reconsider your sentence." James' eyes widened. "Really? Does that mean I can go home?" The official sighed. "Not exactly. They will reduce your sentence if you formally apologize in court and accept responsibility for your actions." James frowned. "But I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was just a joke." The man gave him a sharp look. "James, listen to me. Their laws are different from what you're used to. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can go home. If you fight this, you could be here for a long time." James swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew the official was right. This wasn't his country. The rules were different, and he had already seen how serious they were about their traditions and laws. A few days later, James was taken back to court. He stood before the judge, his hands slightly shaking. The courtroom was quiet as the translator repeated the judge's words. "You have been given a chance to reduce your punishment," the judge said. "Do you accept responsibility for your actions?" James took a deep breath. He wanted to explain again that he hadn't meant any harm, that it was just a misunderstanding. But now he realized that wouldn't help him. He had to do what was necessary to go home. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly. "I deeply regret my actions. I did not understand the importance of respecting the royal guards. I apologize." The judge nodded and spoke again. The translator turned to James and said, "Your sentence is reduced to 6 months." James felt weak with relief. 6 months was still a long time, but it was better than 5 years. As he was led back to his cell, he whispered to himself, "I will make it through this." And one day, he would be free again.